And well, we would like to welcome Malcolm and Katia that this morning will be presenting this interesting 5-year project titled In Search of Decoupling. How can we combine climate sustainability with economic growth, good jobs, and public preferences? And they're going to be presenting, and then we will have also, after these presentations, a space to have a dialogue and comments and questions of ideas or things that has come out on our minds while we listen to them. So with no further ado, I'm going to present formally Professor Malcolm Fairbrother. He's a sociologist based at Uppsala University and a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies in Sweden. His research focuses on the politics of environmental policy making with a central question in his current work. How can we protect the climate without halting economic growth? Supported by the Swedish Research Council, he leads a project exploring the decoupling of greenhouse emissions from economic activity, which is one of the most pressing issues in contemporary climate policy. He has worked at the universities in the UK, Austria, Canada, and Sweden, and he's originally from Vancouver. Also this morning, Dr. Katia Rhodes, she will be also joining, and she's an associate professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, where she also leads the Zero Emission Sustainability team, and her research focuses on designing effective and publicly acceptable climate policies that support transitions to low carbon economy. Drawing on tools such as surveys, energy economy modeling, and media analysis, her work explores the intersection of climate sustainability and economic growth. Dr. Rhodes brings a blend of academic and policy experience, having worked at the British Columbia Climate Action Secretariat, where she led the GHG emission modeling and economic analysis for the provincial clean CBC. So thank you for joining us. And we can start now the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Valentina. So everybody's seeing my slides okay? Yep. So Katia met Steve, who's on the call, a few months ago, and sort of had the two of them hatch this idea of some sort of collaboration. So what I'm going to present today is a mix of an overview of a kind of big multi-year international interdisciplinary research project, which several of us on the call are involved in and I'm leading. And I'm going to present some of the sort of findings and insights that have come out of that. But I should say we're sort of 2/3 of the way through, but not all the way through. So there's still very much kind of work being done in the different areas I'm going to talk about. So in terms of Q&A, I think anything that comes up from what Katya or I talk about, of course, is fair game for discussion. But we do still have a kind of window of time to incorporate new ideas in what we're doing as well. So if you have thoughts about things, directions we can take what I talk about, that's most welcome. So the project is not a communications project per se, but I think it has implications for communication. And that's a little bit why I think it sort of makes sense for us to present this to all of you who are maybe more on the kind of environmental communication side in different kinds of ways. So let me just start by saying I'm not an environmental communication professional, but when I think about what a lot of environmental communication is, it tends to be focused on a lot of really alarming problems. So if we start with climate change, of course, there's bad news. If you go looking for it, it's not hard to find. Emissions keep going up. In some ways, they're going up more each year than ever before. So, that's pretty depressing. If we go looking for other problems, they're also there. The crisis of nature or biodiversity, in some ways is, I think, even more depressing and daunting, and there's bad news on that. And if we want to keep going, we can. The plastic pollution crisis, also pretty bad. But in my experience, when talking to researchers, advocates, the public, just about anybody, People sort of nod their heads and acknowledge this stuff, but they kind of already know it. And I think what I try to remind people of actually is sort of the opposite. So when I was growing up, the scariest environmental problem of them all, arguably at the time, was the thinning of the ozone layer. And as you all probably know, essentially we solved it. So starting in the 1980s, when scientists raised the alarm, the world got together and essentially introduced an international regime that has been hugely successful. International relations scholars have written about this in some ways as humanity's finest hour ever on anything, not just the environment, but anything, you know. Scientists sound the alarm, policymakers from around the globe come together, solve the problem. I mean, that doesn't happen very often, but it did happen with the ozone layer. But it's not the only success case. So I always like to say I'm a couple of IQ points stupider than I would otherwise have been because when I was a baby kid growing up, etc., I was exposed to a lot of lead because back then, in the 1970s, we were still adding lead to vehicle fuels in large quantities. And, the world was exposed as a consequence and it harmed children's brain, including mine, including possibly all of you. But the good news is kids are less exposed to that now because, as of 4 years ago, every country in the world has now banned, adding lead to vehicle fuels. So there's another win. Acid rain was another big problem when I was growing up in Europe, as in North America. The problem has alleviated substantially. We used to be acidifying aquifers, gradually eroding forests, buildings, and eventually it became clear that this was doing a tremendous amount of harm to ecosystems. It turns out it was also doing a lot of harm to our health, and we've moved in the right direction on that. Dioxins, slightly more qualified in the sense that this is a little bit segmented depending on whether we're looking in the global north or global south. But at least in the global north, again, we're less exposed to this quite harmful pollutant than we used to be. And I think this contrast between the successes and the failures is really captured by this graphic, which shows three different types of pollution indexed to 1995, emerging from the exact same sources, which is US power plants producing electricity from coal. And what you can see is that nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides have declined dramatically, which is the major reason why we have so much less acid rain now. Whereas, of course, CO2 is moved a little bit lower than where it was in 1995, but not very much. So the contrast in the performance of humanity in dealing with these different things is quite dramatic. Now, you might say, oh, well, maybe just the dirty industries have moved to China or other global south parts of the world. But of course, we know that China got serious about pollution in the early 2010s. And research has now come out showing that, as you can see here, literally, even in just a decade, China has taken measures that are extending people's lifespans by up to 2 years. So it's not that we've just sort of moved the problem elsewhere. It's that the world has, in some cases, actually succeeded phenomenally well in dealing with these kinds of problems. However, that leads me a little bit to our project, which engages with the question of, should this even be possible? What can we actually hope to accomplish environmentally on climate change and other unresolved problems if the world economy continues to grow? Because the message that I think you get from a lot of research, a lot of academic sources about environmental topics, is that it's impossible, as these authors, for example, claim, to hope for significant environmental sustainability, real environmental sustainability, unless we dramatically reform our economy in some sense. Now, the authors you see here are big advocates of what they call degrowth. And I should clarify, there's a lot about the degrowth agenda that those of us in this project agree with. But they more or less say you cannot decouple environmental harms from economic growth. And if that's true, the implications are absolutely massive because we need essentially a revolutionary transformation of the world economy. Now, if we need that in order to save the Earth, then that's the job we have to get on with. But the question our project, in a sense, starts with is that in fact necessary? It has big implications, I think, not just for academia, but also for policymaking, public debate. If it is in fact not necessary to overturn the global economy in order to save the Earth, then that has major implications for how we focus our energies. Now, here's a graphic that sort of provides, in a sense, the best evidence that economic growth is hugely damaging to the environment and must inevitably be. If we simply correlate at any given time, of course, GDP per capita with lots of measures of environmental impact, arguably the biggest one of all right now, CO2 emissions per capita, the correlation is right before your eyes. It's very, very strong. I'm not going to deny that. But I think the counter argument is a graphic like this, which shows that even countries with broadly similar levels of development, standards of living, GDP per capita, whatever you want to refer to, have moved in very different directions in, recent times. I'm originally from Western Canada, as you can see here, an abysmal performer on climate change. I now live in Sweden. I've also lived in the UK, countries that have not done enough, but have done quite a lot more than some others. And I think if the entire world had done what some of the best performing countries had done, we would be in a much better place. So the question arises, why have we done so poorly on climate change? And, why have some countries done especially poorly? And I think a wonderful answer to this question came from the Canadian Minister of Climate and Environment a little over a year ago. He's a former hardcore environmental activist. I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's trying to do good things in a very challenging context. And his answer to the question in a moment of breathtaking honesty was, we've simply never actually tried. In other words, Canada has never seriously tried to hit its climate targets. And I think that's absolutely right. So the hypothesis of our project is that this huge failure on the part of humanity should be understood as a political failure, not an economic inevitability. We work from the assumption that those divergent trajectories of different countries that I showed you a moment ago are political outcomes. And therefore, the key challenge in overcoming climate change and other environmental problems is, in fact, to overcome the political barriers that are keeping us stuck on those problems. And insofar as we are correct that this is a political outcome, of course, the obvious question to ask next is, how has this been done in the cases of success that I talked about? What are the strategies that have overcome the opposition that we've seen so clearly in, for example, the case of climate change? So there's, as I see it, two clear sources of opposition to climate action and solving other environmental problems: industry and public skepticism or hostility. I should say I'm giving you a picture of possibility. I think solving climate change would actually be quite feasible if we could deal with these political barriers. But that is not to say that the political barriers are a minor issue or somehow not daunting. They are hugely daunting. We are up against a lot. We are up against forces that are well-resourced, that are powerful, that have very effective strategies, and so far they have beaten us. So I'm not saying this is great news, but I think we should at least aim at the right target in focusing our energies. So why is it that climate change has proven so hard to solve when other problems were so solvable? I think there are two main underlying differences between climate change and those other problems which have led us to where we are. The first is that in the success cases, eventually the key polluting industries accepted that they would be regulated. They, in some cases, opposed regulation, in some cases, denied scientific claims about the harms they were doing for a very long time. Uh, I mean, it's arguably the scandal of the 20th century is how long the automobile industry held out the claim that leaded fuel wasn't doing any harm and was totally necessary for cars to keep doing what they were doing. It's an absolute scandal. But they did eventually relent and, of course, accept that unleaded fuel would come and it would come by legislation. And in the end, it was a big political nothing burger by the time it happened. But in the case of the fossil fuel industry, although they have now largely dropped the full-on climate denial, I just don't think they've ever actually accepted that they would be regulated in the same sort of way. They have clung on and delayed and denied. And I think that's quite different. The second major difference is that in all of those success cases, we didn't really need to ask ordinary people to pay any kind of price to solve any of those problems. The inconveniences or economic costs to ordinary people of dealing with all those other things, the ozone layer, acid rain, dioxins, and so on, really were trivial. Whereas in the case of climate change, I think we are, to some degree, asking people to pay a price, relative to a status quo in which they do absolutely nothing. I don't think the price is very large, but I do think that we are asking people for something, and it's very unusual for policymakers of the world to go to the people of the world and say, look, I need to ask something of you. Other than paying taxes and occasionally volunteering to join the army, we don't normally expect policymakers to go to people cap in hand and ask for things. But in the case of climate change, in a sense, that's the position they're in. So that's the interpretation that I'm kind of persuaded by of the difference between climate change and these other problems. As I say, we know that the fossil fuel industry has resisted. They have, we've got documented evidence that they have intentionally misled the public and policymakers. They've been lobbying against anything that would threaten their business, like alternative green technologies, going back decades. They funded astroturf organizations. They funded think tanks to, do work for them that slowed down progress on the issue and so on. But that sets them apart from other industries that have not done these kinds of things, and that's why the successes have been possible. Now, when it comes to public opinion, this Economist article from a couple of years ago sort of makes the point. There's been quite a lot of backlash from ordinary people to a lot of the things that policy experts have recommended, and in some cases, policymakers have even sort of proposed or tried to implement. The Yellow Vests protests in France is maybe the most famous one. There's also been referenda on various kinds of carbon taxes and things where they have been defeated. And public opinion, I don't think, has really actually helped us with respect to climate change. So the question is, why are people so hostile to these sorts of solutions? One possibility is, of course, climate denial. People just don't believe the problem exists. But we have survey evidence from many, many countries, as you can, for example, see here, that shows that essentially we've won the war to convince people around the world that climate change is real, uh, it's anthropogenic, it's something to worry about. Most people would like their governments to do something about it. But nonetheless, they seem to be hostile to a lot of sort of specific actions. So let me show you, I think, a really fascinating graphic that captures, in a sense, the crux of the problem on the public opinion side. So this is a time series of a survey question that's been asked over 30 years here in Sweden by a very high quality academic research center. Probably very few of you read Swedish. So here's a nice Google Translate. And the survey question that's been asked since 1990 is essentially how much do you agree with or how much do you support investing in making society environmentally friendly, even if that means low or no economic growth. Except, and here's the key thing, at some point, I don't know why, in 2010, they took away the latter part of that statement. So it became simply this. And if you contrast those two statements and you look at how the support changed dramatically from one year to the next with very little trend before or after, what you can see is how much of a difference it makes to people's opinions about pursuing sustainability or pursuing environmental policy if you tell people it's going to cost you a bunch of economic growth. People become a lot more hostile to the green agenda if they are told it's going to cost economic growth. Whereas if you suggest it isn't, they're pretty overwhelmingly supportive. So our project essentially grapples with this sort of challenge and this landscape. Our messages to people coming out of our project so far are that climate change does not actually need to be hugely costly or require massive changes to society. It's a bit bigger scale than those other success stories I told you about, but it's not fundamentally different. In those cases, and we think potentially in the case of climate change, good policies and good technologies can do a tremendous amount of good at surprisingly low cost to individual people in their lives. Importantly, for those successes to be possible, we did not have to shrink the world economy or individual countries' economies. In fact, GDP expanded dramatically in precisely the periods of time when those successes were achieved. We think this shows that decoupling of environmental harms from economic growth is absolutely feasible. Not so many people in academia focus on population, but some people do. Clearly, population did not have to shrink for us to achieve those environmental successes. Contrary to Greta Thunberg, it's not all blah, blah, blah out there. There is some progress. Sometimes politicians have actually made excellent decisions. When it comes to green energy, of course, the news is phenomenally good in a lot of ways. And lastly, people have an idea that stopping climate change is somehow going to impose a huge burden on the poor. Actually, the truth is just the opposite. It's going to really help the poor because they are the ones who would pay the highest price if the world does not switch tracks to a more sustainable one. But the important point here is that all of these messages, in a sense, give momentum, they give enthusiasm, they give people reasons to support climate action. Whereas opponents of climate action would like everybody to believe exactly the opposite. For example, that saving the earth requires crushing GDP or, massively transforming our economies. And I don't think that's true. So our project studies different societies in very different places, looks at them in terms of emissions and employment profiles, politics, policies, and how they ended up in the positions they're in, good or bad. We're really trying to counter the very prevalent cynicism and distrust out there, which I think is actually blocking a lot of public support for climate solutions. Like I said, we won the war to convince people about the problem. We haven't convinced them about the solutions. And we think a big part of the reason why so much of public opinion is skeptical about climate policies and climate action is because people perceive it as unfair. And in a sense, climate policies as much more costly than they actually need to be. So here's our team who worked together on this project. We come from 3 different countries, 3 different disciplines. We've looked at, more than 3 countries, like 5 countries, sorry. We've looked at we've looked at case studies in many different countries. We're doing different kinds of work captured by this graphic. So here are the core elements of our program. I won't labor on this because I want to move along to Katya's material quite directly now, but I will just say briefly in one part of the project, we're fitting statistical models of emissions outcomes. In one part of the project, we're conducting case studies of successes and failures. And in one part of the project, we're looking quite intensely at the kinds of public beliefs and opinions and attitudes that are relevant for everything I've just talked to you about. I think in the interest of time, I will skip over the specific research questions of the 3 parts of the project, but I can come back to these in the Q&A if people want. I can also share these slides, but with that, I'll hand over to Katya.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks, everyone. It's a privilege to be here and share some of the results with you. So I'm going to talk to you about those key lessons of from past successes in a couple of jurisdictions that represent those rare experiences or rare examples of decoupling. So first, I'll start with the United Kingdom, which seems like a climate frontrunner in that emissions in the United Kingdom fell by 28% and the economy grew by 40% in the last decade. What's interesting about this case is that the UK has a liberal market economy, yet at the same time, it implemented a stringent climate policy regime. And the key pillar of that regime is the 2008 Climate Change Act. This act represents a legally binding framework that has both long-term targets and also short-term interim targets represented via carbon budgets. In addition, the framework has an independent expert panel known as a Climate Change Committee that keeps the government accountable for its climate promises and climate policies announcements. And finally, there is regular reporting and monitoring on the side of government and on the side of the expert panel that, once again, keeps government accountable and allows for climate policy to survive for a long time. What's interesting is that this legislation, this framework, has survived opposition or didn't face strong opposition because the government and business stakeholders work together to dismantle the coal industry and to privatize electricity markets prior to the implementation of the act, which showed that coal to gas switching at the time of electricity privatization was seen as both a profitable or cost-saving approach that is good for business and is also good for environment or better for environment. In addition, after the implementation of the non-fossil fuel obligation in 1989, which was initially aimed at creating more nuclear generation, we saw the rise of renewable energy, and then later that obligation became a renewable obligation, allowing for more emission reductions and cost savings. Next slide. So one of the most significant impacts of the Climate Change Act has been the creation of a very strong discursive environment within the UK climate policy or policymaking institutions in general that has transformed climate change from a silent concern to overseen by just one department to a multi-sector cross-cutting priority that you can see here on the graph is integrated across all departmental mandates, and which is quite rare and not seen in many jurisdictions. Next slide. So in summary, what we learned from the United Kingdom is that such legislations legally binding frameworks like the Climate Change Act are very important and have a positive influence on policymaking and greenhouse gas emission outcomes. It helps if we have prior weakening of high-emitting industries in order to set up such a strong climate policy regime. And finally, for jurisdictions that are currently struggling with national inaction, what we can learn from the United Kingdom, what we've seen, for example, here in British Columbia and in Canada, is that it's possible to adopt similar frameworks at a subnational or state level, where there are still climate-sincere governments and politicians that want to reduce emissions and want to ensure that the climate policy stays in place for a long period of time. So now switching from the national climate leadership, next slide please, to subnational policy successes. I'm located in the province of British Columbia, and it's ironic I speak about this case today because exactly today we see the removal of the consumer carbon tax. But till today, British Columbia has had the most serious carbon tax, one of those rare carbon taxes that applies to almost all emissions, that started as a revenue neutral carbon tax and benefited low-income households via tax credits. The schedule was for the carbon tax stringency was set up at a predictable rate, giving businesses and consumers a lot of certainty about technology and behavior choices. And back in 2008, when the tax was implemented, we had the center-right government that was acting on the financial crisis. And because the financial crisis and the economy mattered a lot to people, the government managed to sneak in a mix of many effective climate policies without much public engagement. So obviously one of them was the carbon tax, but there were other non-tax policies that were later copied at the national level in Canada. One of them is a low carbon fuel standard that requires reductions in average carbon intensities in transportation fuels, so in gasoline and diesel fuel mix, bringing in more biofuels in the transportation sector. A clean electricity standard is another great example of reducing emissions via regulation. The regulation required that almost all electricity would come from zero emission sources, which allowed for some fossil fuel generation with carbon capture and storage, but because that was not profitable, that did not happen. So we saw the rise in hydro generation. And we also had lots of energy efficiency and zero carbon building regulation improvements. But what's interesting about this whole policy mix case is that the regulations were not really known or affected by public opposition, but the carbon tax was, and it survived by luck. At the time of political elections, the only reason why the carbon tax stayed is because the center-right government we had at the time was trusted a lot for the economy and economic policy. The next government after that center-right government froze the carbon tax, and as I just said in the beginning, the current government reduced the consumer version of the carbon tax to $0 per ton, in line with the federal decision to avoid further polarization about this policy. Next slide. So when the tax was first introduced and then reviewed, I was doing my PhD, and I was wondering about what people think of this policy, if they think it's a good policy, if they support it, and whether people are aware of any climate policy in British Columbia. So I asked that question. And what was really shocking is the result that almost no one knew about climate policy in BC, except for the carbon tax. 25% of respondents could identify one correct climate policy in our province, and that is the carbon tax. In other words, without the carbon tax, there would be no public knowledge of any climate policy. Yet the policy was not the most important policy for greenhouse gas emission reductions. As you can see on this slide, the clean electricity standard, low carbon fuel standard taken together were projected to reduce way more emissions. And yet when you take the levels of strong opposition to the carbon tax and compare them to the two regulations, you see that the carbon tax is 11 to 28 times more politically costly per ton of emissions reduced than the regulations. And then if you look even further into economic costs, of course, you find that the carbon tax is the most economically efficient policy, the cheapest to society compared to those two regulations. So when you look at all of this, you look at the trade-offs, you realize that political costs of climate policy matter a lot more than any economic efficiency gains of the carbon tax. Next slide. Most recently, we've had a different kind of governments that were quite climate sincere and progressive in terms of implementing additional policies and increasing stringency of existing policies, mostly relying on pricing and regulations. So we've implemented a new zero emission vehicle sales mandate that requires that all of our vehicle sales come from electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles in 2035. And we're already seeing the effects of the policy. The number of sales is higher than required by the regulation. We are increasing the stringency of the low carbon fuel standard. We implemented methane regulations in oil and gas cap. And we were planning to increase the carbon tax to $170 per ton by 2030, but it became too polarizing, so we had to reduce the rate to zero. And this is, in fact, a political election issue. As you can see on this slide, we are having a federal election in Canada, and the carbon tax now, the industrial portion of the carbon tax now is attacked by the opposition party. So what are the final lessons from this case? Many other cases in other jurisdictions. Political costs matter. What can be the most economically efficient and beneficial policy to society is not what people think or perceive. Public ignorance can be bliss when it comes to regulations. People are not aware of those policies, but when you give people information about them, they seem to generally support them. We, of course, need to rely on the policy mix, but in this policy mix, it seems like regulations and those regulations that have market flexibility features with credit trading have to be a dominant policy with some industrial pricing and some incentives. And finally, we live in the times of climate delays and climate misinformation. We need to use this as a policy window as much as possible, as we see the attacks on our industrial pricing, as we see attacks on emissions caps, and now from down south on Canada's exports of goods. We could seriously consider a carbon tariff as a response to those threats. In order to keep our policy in place and increase stringency of existing policies, we could also learn from the United Kingdom and other jurisdictions with better governance systems to protect our policy long term so that we don't see a consistent climate policy removal. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Malcolm and Katya, for this very interesting presentation. So now we open up the space for some dialogue, questions. You can either participate by putting the question in the chat, or if you want to open your microphone and ask, you just raise your hand. Also, comments are welcome. Heather, please.
Hi, Heather with Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. This is very interesting because we have the Climate Commitment Act, which is not a carbon tax, but it's a cap on carbon with a market for allowances. And California was the first state in the United States to have a similar law, and I'm pretty sure that studies since cap and trade passed in California show the exact same thing, which is that emissions have gone down in California, but it's thanks to the clean energy fuel standard and other climate policies, and not thanks to this very contentious cap and trade law. So I was just wondering if you had done any parallel analysis into California, or if that came up at all.
Katya, can I respond to that? So as a former resident of California, because that's where I got my master's and PhD, I know a little bit about it. In the paper that we wrote about the case of British Columbia, Katya and I guess we just briefly touched on the case of California as well, because for what happened in British Columbia, California did serve to some extent as a model. So when British Columbia introduced its carbon tax in 2008, that was partly because the premier of British Columbia and Arnold Schwarzenegger, as then governor of California, had sort of struck up a friendship, and they were both center-right politicians who were interested in doing something about climate change. So there's a little bit of sort of tie-in there. But on the topic of cap and trade or market trading systems that you bring up, I think um, I think there's actually a lot to be said for those systems in two specific ways that actually articulate with what we've talked about today, which is, on the one hand, as Katya said, good climate policies are not necessarily the policies that the public knows about, to be honest. And cap and trade tends to make people's eyes glaze over extremely quickly. So they don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And yet they are very effective systems. They're very cost-effective systems as well. And yet, it really doesn't seem to be something that generates a lot of opposition. So here in Europe, where I'm speaking to you from right now, we have a gigantic European emissions trading system with a, absolutely enormous carbon market, and most people don't even know about it, even though it's done a tremendous amount of good. So I think there's a lot to be said for cap and trade on that level. There's also a huge advantage of it in the sense that what is the main political opposition to it potentially? Potentially, it's industry opposition more than public opposition. So if the public doesn't know and doesn't care, the people that might care are the ones that are going to be regulated and fall under the market. But there's a very obvious political tool available to get those kinds of big emitters to agree, which is you grandfather them in and give them massive amounts of concessions, or massive amounts of free permits, and then gradually taper those out, which is exactly what Europe has done. And I think California did the same thing. So I think it's actually a phenomenal strategy that's probably more politically promising than carbon taxes, because carbon taxes basically have proved pretty unpopular everywhere.
And if I can just quickly comment on that, the industrial pricing system we have in Canada, known as the output-based pricing system, is a version of that cap and trade type of policy. It's a regulatory trading system that's based on performance, and it has a key component that is called the large emitter trading system, and the policy is not seeing the same amount of opposition at all whatsoever, even from the industry. In fact, a lot of industrial stakeholders want the policy to stay in place because it gives them certainty about their investments and it doesn't apply a full price on emissions. So it's not even popular to remove the policy, but in the current elections, we are seeing there is an attack on that in addition to the consumer carbon tax. So we'll see what happens.
Interesting stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Lara also has a comment or question, please.
Yes, this is Lara's husband, Gerardo. So first of all, I love the presentation. Very optimistic. I agree with a lot of it. But one of the things that worries me is that many times, the costs of climate change tend to be underestimated, especially given that many times there are tipping points, times when, there's a point of no return. And we don't know exactly when we're crossing them, and we usually don't realize that we crossed them until we're on the other side. Have you looked at, kind of like what if scenarios of some of those tipping points? And if not, just what, can you give me an opinion or your conception about them? Thank you.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I wasn't sure if I heard correctly. Did you say the costs of climate change are underestimated, or the costs of climate action or climate policies are underestimated?
I think the cost of the actual change in the future. I mean, and that's why it's kind of hard. What would the cost be associated with increased frequency and intensity of hurricanes in Florida, or
Yeah, so
increased
okay, so then I can just give you my take on what the literature says about that. So I mean, essentially different methods to estimate the economic damages of climate change can give very different figures. But I think the credible estimates go up to like, 1/3 of GDP in plausible kind of scenarios by like mid 20th century. In other words, wiping out 1/3 of the economic value that humanity creates each year if we, basically do nothing about climate change from now to then. Now, of course, you still have to make some assumptions about what it means to do nothing. I mean, how many solar panels we're talking about versus how many new coal mines and so on. There's all kinds of assumptions about what people might plausibly do, but it's a lot, right? Like whether it's underestimated or overestimated, I can't really say. But any credible economic assessment shows that it's far cheaper to, stop it than to just suffer the consequences. So, you know, but where in that range of possibility is most plausible? It's hard to say.
Yeah, and the second part is then, given those uncertainties, then you have to also, grapple with tipping points in climate systems. Basically that once you get beyond a certain point, no matter what we do, you continue, for example, losing the ice cap in the North Pole. Most climate scientists more or less agree right now that there's not much we can do about keep losing the polar cap. So is that somehow included into your modeling?
So our modeling has been more, in a sense, trying to understand why societies have ended up in different sorts of places in their emissions and what the relationship is with employment. So our project does not include sort of damage modeling of the kind you're talking about. I think that's important work. I think there are good people out there that are doing that. I can give you like I said, I've given you my take on it, but that's not something that we're doing as part of our project. But I agree with you, the tipping points are scary. Here in Sweden, one of the things that scares me the most is that climate change could mean getting a lot colder up here if we suddenly lose the Gulf Stream, stuff like that. And scientists can't say with certainty what would happen in different scenarios.
Okay, thank you. So Gabby, you also want to participate?
Sure, thanks very much. Thanks for a great talk, really thought-provoking, and it's wonderful to see these perspectives in EC circles. So bringing it back to environmental communication, I'm thinking as you're speaking, what are the opportunities and the need for environmental communication here? Because from my perspective, we see a large portion of environmental communication research and practice orientated towards building citizen climate literacy on the assumption that people need to understand this thing we call climate change to exert, bottom-up pressure on law, to elect governments that will enact the right policies. But from what you're saying, if effective climate policy does not require well-informed citizen support, where should we be directing environmental communication efforts now? And does it mean, are we sort of in a phase where, I'm going to say this in an extreme sort of way, I don't really mean it like this, but, where people don't matter so much. It's actually the lobbying piece and the climate policymakers who should be in our sights in terms of environmental communication efforts. And I like that idea because I think it's very direct, and because the time frame is so tiny and it's so urgent, we need to go right to the source of decision making and potential power to make change on climate change. So just your thoughts on that. Or is it still a much broader piece for environmental communication, and do kind of audiences, people still matter, or is it just the policymakers we need to turn our attention to for environmental communication, or something else? What's your thinking there?
I mean, I can respond to that, but Katya, do you want to go first?
Sure, I think you bring up an important point, and I don't think there is just one approach that works for all jurisdictions. Certain Western jurisdictions are in a situation where they don't have their own energy resources or have limited resources, so they have to be climate frontrunners. Other jurisdictions that are fossil fuel dependent can also reduce emissions, but for other reasons, and sometimes it's not climate policy that reduces emissions. And of course, we have jurisdictions that are completely climate insincere. So how you work in those three different types of jurisdictions, I think is going to be a different approach in each. In some cases, it seems like it's best to not engage in a widespread public engagement in the way we've done that in most democracies for over 2 decades, 3 decades. And with that, we see that we have policies in California and BC and in Canada that people are not even aware of. Even when there are attempts to call a clean fuel standard or low carbon fuel standard a second carbon tax, no one pays attention to that. So I think that's a credible approach to go with. Let people know about this policy. It's on the website. There is some version of a democratic engagement process, but if people don't oppose it, just keep it, and the price is not directly visible at the pump. In other cases where, public agrees, maybe it's Sweden or other countries, working directly with policymakers advocating for the most creative and effective solutions is exactly what we need to do. And, I'm not an environmental communications expert, but I hear a lot that we need to tackle climate misinformation, disinformation. I don't think we have funding for that. Like the effort and money that goes into climate misinformation, disinformation is so enormous. I don't know if academia and advocacy groups have the same level of funding to effectively, sit on social media every day and confront every single piece of misinformation. So in terms of communication broadly, I think right now, for what we're seeing at least in the Western world, we need to focus on the economy and say the economy, it matters. We need to grow it, and hopefully in a low carbon way, with climate being a co-benefit. Versus, a decade ago or 5 years ago, it was the opposite. Climate is the priority and the economy is a co-benefit. So perhaps reverse that trade-off communication approach. Malcolm?
I mean, I also think it's a great question. I guess my general feeling is we can't give up on the public, in the sense that I want them to continue, or at least I have to hope that some of them will raise the issue of climate and sustainability with their elected representatives. We need people to kind of bring that up at least once in a while with the politicians, or it gets kicked down the priority chain for the politicians. So I think we need to continue doing that. But the main thing, in a sense, is I would just like more people to kind of keep in perspective that, saving the earth costs something, but it really doesn't cost much. And in many cases, it saves us more money than it costs. So it should be sort of this kind of boring, benign kind of topic. And I would like to vaccinate or inoculate people against these messages that it somehow is going to be hugely economically damaging and so on. So I agree with Katya. This kind of more optimistic message is what we're sort of recommending in that sense. But Gabby, I appreciate what you're saying, that in some ways it would simplify life to just go straight to the policymakers. And I guess the one thing I would say is, if the policymakers have some idea of something constructive they want to do, we shouldn't hold them back just because the public don't know about it.
Great answer. Thank you.
Steve?
Hey, this is going to be the first of multiple.
I can't hear Steve.
Steve, your microphone.
No.
Can you put it in the chat, Steve?
Yeah, do you want to write it in the chat? I mean, we're almost out of time anyway.
So just while Steve's writing it in the chat to
How
follow
about
up.
now?
Yes.
Oh, so hear you. If you're good, you go.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve. Oh, we did hear you.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can hear
Now
you,
it's-
Steve.
But he can't hear us.
Yes.
Gabby, do you want to go with
Yeah,
your
so
question?
just really just almost summarizing what you said then, Malcolm, that it's kind of, you think that it's the messaging that needs to change rather than the publics to whom we focus our messaging, but maybe a bit of both, right? So it's going direct to the policymakers and supporting policy with the right kind of EC communication, but maybe it's like teaching those policymakers to communicate with their constituents in a way that will build support for climate. What did you call it? Climate sincere policies. I haven't heard that phrase, but I really like it. Anyway, no, that's great. Can we hear you now, Steve, or are we still struggling?
I think he logged off. So time is up, but I want to thank everyone, and thank you, Malcolm and Katya, for sharing this. This has been very insightful. And I go personally with a question like, how political do we have to become environmental communication? Does it need to be political? So there are really great questions for us as professionals regarding this task. So this session will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I will be sending the link, and thank you everyone for joining, and I hope to see everyone in our next EC meeting. Thank you. I'll end the session now.
Thank you, Valentina. Thanks, everyone.